Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling some pretty complex pharmacology, stuff that's really high stakes in clinical practice.
That's right.
We're aiming to give you the essential synthesis on biologic response-modifying drugs, BRMs, and also DRNs, the disease-modifying antirheumatic drugs. Kind of a shortcut through the dense textbook stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're talking about drugs that, well, they fundamentally change how the body's immune system deals with diseases. Things like cancer, autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, even infections.
That really is the heart of it. These aren't your typical chemicals that just, broadly attack cells. They're targeted biologics.
And they fall into two big buckets.
Pretty much. You've got the hematopoietic drugs, think of those as supportive players, and then the immunomodulating drugs, which are really about regulating the immune response itself.
Gotcha.
And to really get what these drugs do, we probably need a quick refresher on the immune system they're messing with.
Good idea. Lay it on us.
Okay, so think of two main branches. First, there's humoral immunity. This is run by B lymphocytes, B cells. They're kind of like the intelligence agents and the factories.
Factories.
Yeah, they turn into plasma cells and just churn out antibodies. Specific antibodies for specific threats.
Okay, B cells make the antibodies. What about the T cells?
Right, that's the other branch. Cell-mediated immunity. This is the territory of T lymphocytes, T cells. If B cells are the factories, T cells are more like the field commanders and the special forces.
Oh, right.
You've got cytotoxic T cells. Those are the direct killers, the assassins. And then you have T helper and T suppressor cells. They're the controllers, dialing the immune response up or down. All these drugs we're talking about, they tweak this whole complex system.
Makes sense. So let's start with those supportive ones you mentioned, the hematopoietic drugs. In cancer care, you always hear they don't kill the cancer directly.
Exactly. They're support crew. Their job is to stimulate the bone marrow, that process called hematopoiesis, the making of blood cells. They help the body recover from things like chemotherapy.
And the main players here are the CSFs, colony-stimulating factors.
Yep. Drugs like filgrastim, that's a GCSF, granulocyte CSF, and sargramostim, which is a GM-CSF, granulocyte macrophage CSF.
How do they work? Like, what are they actually doing in the bone marrow?
They essentially bind to the early stage cells, the progenitor cells, and basically give them a kickstart. They tell them, okay, time to grow up, multiply, and become what you're supposed to be. Specifically, they boost the production of neutrophils, those critical infection-fighting white blood cells that chemo often wipes out.
So the big benefit is getting patients through that dangerous low white count period faster after chemo.
Precisely. It cuts down the duration of neutropenia, less risk of serious infection, and importantly, it often lets oncologists stick to the planned chemo doses without delays, which is huge for treatment effectiveness.
Okay, now this sounds like something where timing would be absolutely critical.
Oh, it is. This is a non-negotiable safety point. Filgrastim and sargramostim must not be given within 24 hours of getting myelosuppressive chemo.
Not within 24 hours either side. Or just before.
Specifically, not within 24 hours of the chemo administration. So you don't give it right before, during, or immediately after. You need that 24-hour window after the chemo finishes.
Why is that window so crucial?
Because they work against each other directly. Chemo kills rapidly dividing cells, right?
Right.
Well, CSFs make bone marrow cells divide rapidly. So if you give them together, the CSF makes the cells vulnerable just as the chemo comes along to kill them. It's counterproductive and potentially harmful. You let the chemo do its thing, wait 24 hours, then give the CSF to speed up the recovery.
That makes total sense. Okay, what about side effects? What do patients feel?
Generally fairly mild. Fever, some muscle aches are common, but the one everyone remembers, the one that's almost a sign the drug is working, is bone pain.
Bone pain. From stimulating the marrow.
Exactly. It's often described as a deep ache. It's literally the feeling of the bone marrow kicking into high gear, expanding production. It can be quite intense for some patients, but it's usually manageable and temporary. Flushing is another one you see sometimes.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so that covers the support crew. Let's shift gears to the immunomodulators, the ones that directly regulate the immune response. First up, interferons. These seem to do a lot of different things.
They really do. They have three main properties: antiviral, anti-tumor, and immunomodulating.
How do they manage all three?
Well, naturally, our own T cells release interferons when they detect a virus. They act locally to tell nearby healthy cells, hey, brace yourselves, stop viruses from replicating inside you. They also boost the activity of immune cells like macrophages and NK, natural killer cells.
So that covers antiviral and anti-tumor. What about immunomodulating?
That's where they get used for autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. In MS, the immune system is mistakenly attacking the body. Interferons can help dial back that specific dysfunctional immune response, sort of calming things down.
Interesting. Now, you often see interferons with names like interferon. What's that PEG part about? Pegylation.
Ah, yeah, pegylation. It's a neat bit of chemistry, actually. They attach a molecule called polyethylene glycol PEG to the interferon molecule.
Okay. Why? What does adding that chain do?
Think of it like adding a bulky, slow-dissolving coat to the drug. It makes the whole molecule much larger.
And a bigger molecule gets absorbed slower.
Exactly. It slows down absorption, and more importantly, it dramatically increases the drug's half-life in the body. So instead of needing, say, daily injections, the patient might only need one weekly. It makes treatment much more manageable.
That's a huge practical benefit. But interferons have a reputation for side effects, don't they?
They definitely do. Flu-like symptoms are almost universal: fever, chills, headache, just feeling generally unwell, malaise. That happens a lot.
But there's something more serious.
Yes. The major dose-limiting side effect is fatigue, and we're not talking about just feeling a bit tired.
How bad can it get?
It can be profound. The source material mentions patients being potentially confined to bed on higher doses. It really impacts quality of life and can be the reason someone has to stop treatment.
Wow. And isn't there a black box warning, too? Something about mental health?
Yes, specifically for interferon alpha-2b, there is a warning about it potentially causing or worsening autoimmune conditions and also neuropsychiatric symptoms, things like depression or suicidal thoughts. It's a serious consideration.
Definitely something to weigh carefully. Okay, let's move on to what you called the guided missiles earlier, monoclonal antibodies, the MAs.
Right. Adalimumab, trastuzumab, anything ending in imab. These were, and still are, revolutionary.
Because they're so specific.
Exactly. Compared to traditional chemo, which is more like a shotgun blast, MABs are like sniper rifles. They're designed to target very specific proteins or receptors found predominantly on cancer cells or, in other cases, on immune cells involved in autoimmune disease. The idea is maximum effect on the target, minimum collateral damage to healthy cells.
Let's talk examples. Adalimumab, Humira, and infliximab, Remicade. They're used a lot for RA and Crohn's, right? They target TNF.
Correct. They're anti-tumor necrosis factor agents. TNF is a key inflammatory signaling molecule heavily involved in diseases like rheumatoid arthritis.
Okay, so blocking TNF reduces inflammation. But then why the black box warnings about serious infections and even lymphoma? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but TNF isn't just bad. It plays a crucial role in our normal immune defense, especially against certain types of infections like tuberculosis or fungal infections. It helps keep those things in check, often in a latent state.
Ah, so if you block TNF to treat the RA.
You might inadvertently lower the body's defenses against those latent infections, allowing them to reactivate and become serious, even life-threatening. That's why screening for latent TB before starting these drugs is absolutely essential.
And the lymphoma risk.
That's thought to be related to the long-term immune suppression as well, potentially allowing malignancies to develop more easily. It's a known risk, though thankfully not extremely common.
And infliximab has another specific warning, right? Something about heart failure.
Yes, this one's important. It's contraindicated, meaning absolutely should not be used. In patients with severe heart failure, class 3 or 5, it can actually make the heart failure worse.
Wow. Why would an anti-inflammatory drug worsen heart failure?
It's complex, but it seems TNF might actually have some protective or stabilizing roles in certain chronic heart failure situations. Blocking it completely can disrupt that balance. It highlights how interconnected these systems are and why careful assessment is key.
We see heart issues with other mAbs too, like trastuzumab or Herceptin for breast cancer.
Yes, trastuzumab targets the HER2 protein, which is great for fighting HER2 positive breast cancer, but it carries a black box warning for potential ventricular dysfunction and heart failure. The heart needs to be monitored closely.
And then there's adalimumab to Sabri for MSNs. That one has a really dramatic safety story.
It really does. It's highly effective for MS, but it was actually pulled from the market for a while.
Why?
Because of a link to a rare but often fatal brain infection called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, PML. It's caused by a virus that most people carry harmlessly, but suppressing the immune system in a specific way, as adalimumab does, can allow it to reactivate in the brain.
So is it back now?
Yes, but only under a very strict distribution program with rigorous monitoring. It just underscores the potency and the specific, sometimes severe risks these targeted therapies can carry.
Okay, deep breath. Let's move to another group of immunomodulators, the interleukins, specifically aldesleukin proleukin, used for kidney cancer and melanoma.
Right. Aldesleukin is basically a manufactured version of interleukin-2, or IL-2.
And what does IL-2 do?
It's a powerful stimulator of T cells. Giving aldesleukin causes T cells to multiply like crazy and differentiate into something called lymphokine-activated killer cells, or LAK cells.
LAK cells, what's special about them?
The really interesting thing is their selectivity. LAK cells are particularly good at recognizing and destroying cancer cells while generally leaving normal cells alone. That's the therapeutic goal, harnessing the immune system to specifically target the cancer.
Sounds promising. But I have a feeling there's a significant but coming.
There is.
Yeah.
Aldesleukin therapy comes with arguably the most dramatic and dangerous acute toxicity we've discussed, capillary leak syndrome, or CLS.
Capillary leak syndrome. That sounds bad. What happens?
It's exactly what it sounds like. The tiny blood vessels, the capillaries lose their integrity. They stop being able to hold on to large molecules like proteins and albumin, the things that normally keep fluid inside the bloodstream.
So the fluid just leaks out.
Massively.
Right.
It pours out of the blood vessels into the surrounding tissues, the interstitial space. The source material mentions patients can gain 20, even 30 pounds of fluid weight very rapidly.
Good grief. What does that lead to?
It's a systemic crisis. You get severe edema, obviously, but the fluid loss from the vasculature causes blood pressure to plummet. Fluid floods the lungs, causing respiratory distress. The heart is strained, leading to potential heart failure and dangerous arrhythmias. It's a medical emergency.
This sounds like something requiring intensive care monitoring.
Absolutely. It typically only occurs with high-dose interleukin therapy and requires management in a specialized setting, often in ICU. The good news is that it's generally reversible if you stop the drug quickly, but the potential for it demands incredibly close monitoring.
Whew. Okay, let's shift to our final big category. The DMARDs, disease-modifying antirheumatic drugs. For rheumatoid arthritis mainly?
Yes, primarily RA, and the key word there is disease-modifying.
How are they different from, say, NSAIDs or steroids, which also help with RA symptoms?
NSAIDs and corticosteroids are great for reducing inflammation and pain in the symptoms, but they don't fundamentally alter the progression of the underlying autoimmune disease that's destroying the joints. DARDs, on the other hand, have the potential to actually slow down or even stop the disease process itself, preventing further joint damage. That's a crucial difference.
But they take time to work?
Often, yes. That's why they're sometimes called SARD, slow-acting antiheumatic drugs. It can take weeks, sometimes months, to see the full benefit. Patience is key.
Let's highlight one specific DMARD that comes up a lot regarding safety. Methotrexate. It's not a biologic, right? But it's a cornerstone of RA treatment. Why is it considered such a high alert drug?
You're right, it's a non-biologic DMARD. The high alert status comes down to one critical factor: dosing frequency. Methotrexate is also a chemotherapy drug, used in much higher doses, often daily or multiple times a week, to treat cancer. But for rheumatoid arthritis, the standard dose is much lower, and crucially, it's taken once per week.
Oh, I see the potential for error.
Exactly. If someone mistakenly takes the RA dose daily instead of weekly, maybe misreading the prescription or just confusion, they get 7 times the intended dose over the week. This has led to severe toxicity, including bone marrow suppression, liver damage, and even death. It's a tragically common type of medication error.
So hammering home that weekly schedule is paramount for nurses and patients.
Absolutely paramount. Constant reinforcement, clear labeling, patient education, it's non-negotiable. And we also have to remember, it's pregnancy category X, highly teratogenic, cannot be used in pregnancy. Leflutamide, another DMARD, is also category X.
Good point. And isn't folic acid usually given with methotrexate?
Yes, usually prescribed alongside it. Folic acid supplementation helps reduce some of the common side effects, particularly the GI issues and mouth sores.
Okay, so we've covered this huge range of powerful drugs. Let's bring it back to the bedside. What does all this mean for the nursing process? Assessment and implementation must be incredibly thorough.
Couldn't agree more. Assessment starts before the first dose. You need baseline blood work, white blood cell count, absolute neutrophil count, ANC, platelets, because so many of these drugs can suppress the bone marrow.
Right, and checking for infections.
Critically important. You have to actively look for any signs of infection. As we said, rule out latent TB before starting an anti-TNF like infliximab. Make sure the patient doesn't have active sepsis before giving something like etanercept. These drugs can mask or worsen infections.
And cardiovascular status seems vital too.
Definitely. Given the risk of capillary leak syndrome with aldesleukin or the heart failure risks with trastuzumab and infliximab, you need a good baseline cardiovascular assessment. Vital signs, checking for edema, listening carefully to heart and lung sounds.
Any other key history points to check?
Yeah, things like latex allergy, some forms of etanercept might have latex components, and a history of demyelinating disorders like MS is important as some drugs might worsen those conditions.
Okay, so that's assessment. What about implementation? Putting the drug into the patient safely.
Well, managing the immediate infusion reactions is often standard practice. Many of these biologics can cause fever, chills, sometimes shortness of breath during the infusion.
So pre-medication is common.
Very common. Giving acetaminophen and diphenhydramine beforehand can blunt those reactions significantly, making the infusion much more tolerable for the patient.
And then reinforcing those critical safety rules.
Absolutely. Drill that once-weekly dosing for methotrexate. Hammer home the 24-hour rule for hematopoietic drugs like filgrastim relative to chemo. Make sure everyone understands it.
What about patient teaching for when they go home? What do they absolutely need to know?
Several key things. They need to know to report any fever, usually defined as 100.5 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, immediately to their provider. That could signal an infection brewing. They need to understand the signs of capillary leak syndrome. If they're on something like aldesleukin, sudden weight gain or swelling, feeling lightheaded, maybe nasal congestion, those need immediate attention. And given the common side effect of fatigue or potential CNS changes, warning them to avoid driving or other hazardous tasks until they know how the drug affects them is crucial safety advice.
Wow, we really have covered a lot, haven't we? From the CSF's boosting bone marrow, through the interferons, the very targeted mAbs, the potent interleukins, and finally the DMARDs actually slowing disease.
It's a complex but fascinating area. I think the big takeaway is just how sophisticated these drugs are. They offer incredible benefits, true game changers for many diseases.
What?
But that sophistication comes with significant power and specific risks. The core challenge in using these drugs safely is constantly weighing that incredible benefit against the potential for serious harm, whether it's CLS, reactivating TB, dosing errors with methotrexate, or heart problems. That risk-benefit calculation is always front and center.
It really is pharmacology at its most precise and potentially perilous. Well, thank you so much for walking us through this material, sharing these insights from the source. We really hope this deep dive helps all of you connect the dots between how these drugs work and why the safety precautions are so vital. Thanks for joining us.